Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear me. I think you can. It's good to see you, as always. Welcome. I know you're here because of the subject and also because of our speaker. I wanted to start, I thought perhaps it's a bit risky, but recently I've been reading I stumbled across a poem I read years ago by Wilfred Owen called Strange Meeting, in which Wilfred Owen, rather sadly, about a week before he died, dreams of an encounter with a dead man, as it transpires, in hell. It transpires it's a man he himself has killed and who's also a poet. And the line that I find quite harrowing from that poem, the background is that because the man is a poet, what he most abhors about his death is the fact that he will no longer be able to tell the truth to the world as a poet, and that the pity of war will go on, and the pity of war that is distilled will carry on. And that human beings will carry on being as they are, and none will break ranks, though nations trek from progress. And it's that line that seems to epitomize the sense of impotence we feel as we watch what's going on in Syria, where no one seems to be able to break ranks, and nations inclusively trek away from progress, even though we know that something should be done. But in any case, that's enough poetry. What we're very lucky to have today is our distinguished speaker to talk about the practicalities and more contemporary issues that pertain to the situation in Syria. Professor Juan Cole is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He has, as I'm sure you all know, written extensively on modern Islamic movements in Egypt, the Persian Gulf, and South Asia, and has given numerous interviews on the war on terror and the Iraq war in the last 10 years. He speaks Arabic, Farsi, and Urdu, and for 3 decades he has sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. His most recent books, and he's written many, is Engaging the Muslim World, which was published in 2009, and his Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East, was published only 2 years before that in 2007. Professor Cole has been the recipient of various honors and grants, including the Hudson Research Professorship in 2003 and a National Endowment for the Humanities grant in 1991. In November 2004, he was elected president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, also known as MESA, of course. And in 2006, he was the recipient of Hunter College's James Aronson Award for Social Justice, Journalism. Professor Cole holds a BA in History and Literature of Religions from Northwestern University, a Master's in Arabic Studies from the AUC, the American University in Cairo, and he earned his PhD in Islamic Studies from UCLA. Since 2002, he has published the blog Informed Comment. As I'm sure you all know, he's been a regular guest on PBS's Lehrer NewsHour, although I'm not sure that Tom Lehrer still does it, actually. And he's also appeared on ABC Nightly News, Nightline, The Today Show, Charlie Rose, Anderson Cooper, 360, Countdown with Keith Olbermann, The Colbert Report, Democracy Now!, and many others. So we're very lucky to have Professor Juan Cole with us today.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thank you all for coming out this evening. It's just a delight to be here in Abu Dhabi. It's my first time, and I'm enjoying it a great deal. I fear our subject tonight is not very enjoyable, but, well, we have to do the serious work too. And our subject tonight is a different view of the Syrian revolution from the point of view of geopolitics. I'm a historian, I'm not a political scientist, I don't do the Greek letters or the modeling, so it's a common sense approach to geopolitics, and there's some history in it and some journalism in it. But the argument that I'm going to make, I think, is a fairly respectable argument in in diplomatic studies. And it is that we are seeing in Syria the reemergence of a multipolar world, of a world where there isn't a sole superpower. And for the last 20 years, there was. And let me begin with the Cold War. The Cold War was unusual in world history in the sense that for most of modern history, since the emergence of the nation-state system and the emergence of powers that were more powerful than the smaller powers, the world had been divided up into spheres of influence. Assertions were made of exclusivity. So, we had the Monroe Doctrine in the United States, that Europeans not welcome in Latin America. What the Latin Americans thought about that wasn't important. The US made the determination because it was the great power. Likewise, there was the scramble for Africa, where France wanted Senegal and Britain wanted Gambia, apparently mainly because France wanted Senegal. So there was a system of many powers, Austria and Russia and so forth. But during the Cold War, there were two superpowers. And the world was divided up into a chessboard in which the pieces were either Soviet or American. There was an attempt to remain neutral on the part of some countries, but over time, even most of those so-called neutral countries ended up in one camp or another. And the Soviet Union had an important part in the Middle East. It was highly influential in post-revolutionary societies and decolonizing societies. Algeria, for instance, tilted towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Nasser's Egypt did, although Egypt later went into the American camp in the 1970s. For a long time, it was Moscow territory. Khrushchev visited Cairo in 1964 and was lionized. Revolutionary Yemen, once the Imam was overthrown, likewise tended to have a Nasserist tilt and therefore a pro-Soviet one. The Baath party in Syria was a Soviet client state. Over time, after 1968, the Baath party in Iraq gravitated to the Soviet sphere of influence and so forth. And then much of the rest of the Middle East became an American set of allies, Morocco, especially the monarchies, Jordan, the Gulf states, of course. There were switches, Libya in the 60s was very pro-American under the monarchy, under Gaddafi. Well, I don't know if Gaddafi was pro-Soviet. I find it difficult to specify Gaddafi. The Americans at least felt that he was, or that he wasn't reliable, and so forth. Well, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Its system didn't work anymore. And new things emerged. It was very hard on the Soviet Union to collapse. First of all, it broke up. Parts of the Soviet Union became independent countries. You were left with a Russian Federation, which was a much smaller, demographically a much smaller country, although still vast geographically. The Russians lost 10 million people in the decade and a half after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's a really remarkable social statistic. In the absence of a plague or something, to have your population go down by 10 million. And it wasn't because of immigration either. It was the uncertainty and the economic stagnation after the fall of the Soviet Union seems to have caused the Russians to be afraid to have children. And So you had continued mortality and maybe increased mortality because a lot of people drank themselves to death out of despair and hopelessness. And then you had fewer children coming up. And so over time, you went from 150 million to 140 million inside the Russian Federation. So people in the former Soviet Union, in the Russian Federation, were very concerned with domestic issues, and they turned inwards. And so the old Soviet client states were left in the lurch. All of a sudden, Syria was on its own, and the Syrian Baath party wasn't used to being completely on its own and really didn't know how to navigate that, I think. I think the Gulf War in 1991, where the United States and multiple allies throughout the Arab world, Europe, even Argentina, pushed the Iraqi army back out of Kuwait, I don't think that would have been possible in the Cold War. One of the features of the Cold War was that the superpowers checked one another. If the United States wanted to extend its sphere of influence into a new place, the Soviets would try to stop that. And so since Iraq had been a Soviet sphere of influence, I think the Soviets would have just put their feet down and said, no, Iraq is ours and you can't intervene here. But because already the Soviet Union was starting to collapse, even as early as the fall of 1990, Eastern Europe was already gone, and so forth. Gorbachev was not in a position to tell Bush Sr., no, you can't do that. And I think, so the Gulf War is one parenthesis, one end of the parentheses, that marks the beginning of a new phase of global diplomatic history, which was the era of the sole superpower, the era of what was the French called it the American hyperpower. It wasn't a compliment. And in my view, the United States and its allies acted somewhat aggressively, unnecessarily aggressively, towards the Russian Federation. Having seen the Soviet Union as an expansionist power, as a power that threatened Western interests, because, you know, the Cold War was about property, and nothing gets people so excited as about threats to property. But they really didn't want to see Russia re-emerge 5 years or 10 years later as a rival, as a power. And so they did whatever they could to encircle Russia and weaken it. And so they expanded NATO eastward. And that, you know, you have to say, that was pretty in your face. You know, bringing Poland into NATO. I mean, it wasn't necessary. In fact, some people argued that you could just like disband NATO with the end of the Cold War because NATO had been formed to contain the Soviet Union. There was no Soviet Union. Did you really need a NATO anymore? And it is notable that NATO seems to be floundering around looking for a mission in life. And Afghanistan and Libya probably are not going to sustain it. But in any case, the Russians really minded that NATO was extended so far east. And then the US started talking about putting anti-missiles in the Czech Republic, and it intervened, I think it did rightly to do so, but it intervened in the Serbian and Bosnian situation and so forth. So, and then it was very suspicious to the Russians that the Ukraine then all of a sudden had this sort of bourgeois revolution, the Orange Revolution, and they thought that the Americans must be behind it. Now, one of the outcomes of moving to a situation of a sole superpower is that the United States no longer had any checks and balances on it in international affairs. It used to be, did it want to succeed France as a protector state for South Vietnam? well, you know, the Russians and the Chinese might have different ideas about that, and it might have its nose bloodied in Vietnam. So there were things the US just couldn't do, and if it tried to do, it might well fail because it faced opposition from the Soviet Union and to some extent at some points China. But now, as of the 90s, the US could do really whatever it wanted in the world. And there were hawks in the United States who really, really hated Bill Clinton, not because of his romantic foibles, but because they felt that Clinton was squandering an opportunity. They said, you know, we've got a list of countries we'd like to see the government overthrown in, and now there's nothing to stop us from doing that. And what was Clinton doing? Nothing. Why was he just ignoring this enormous opportunity? So they put pressure on him, why don't you invade Iraq? And Clinton didn't think he was going to do that. And then when George W. Bush came into power, he surrounded himself with the hawks, with Dick Cheney and what became known as the neoconservative movement. But it was much broader than those few intellectuals. It was the right wing of the Republican Party, and even some Democrats, I think, were on board with this, who felt that this moment of the U.S. hyperpower shouldn't be squandered. And while that was a hard argument to make in the post-Vietnam era to the American public, which had had its fingers burned with an Asian quagmire, the 9/11 attacks changed the domestic atmosphere. So my analysis would be that there was no longer any check or balance on US action in the world globally. Russia was preoccupied with itself. China was flying under the radar and making money and saying, you guys go have all the adventures you like, or we're counting over here. But then domestically, what 9/11 did was to remove any checks and balances from the domestic scene. And so people were angry, they were afraid, and the Bush administration made full use of that domestic atmosphere to pursue, I think, plans that had long been in place, and they didn't know quite how they'd managed to convince people to let them do that, and now it wasn't a problem. So, you know, they wanted to overthrow the government in Iraq. They didn't know exactly how they could pull that off before 9/11. After 9/11, it was easy. They could just invade. Nobody was going to tell them they couldn't. And when it became clear that the Bush administration was going to invade Iraq without a United Nations Security Council resolution, without asking anybody's permission, without a really good rationale, you didn't hear from Moscow any thunderous denunciations, no pounding of shoes on podiums, nothing. Maybe some inquiries, could we, you know, after it's all over, could we start back up our Lukoil contracts? And the same thing with the Chinese. They were interested, you know, in Sinopec investments after the fact, but nobody tried to stand in the way of the United States in all this. And then, you know, the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were not completely useless to the other lesser powers, especially Afghanistan. As far as I can tell, unlike in Iraq, where maybe there was opposition to some extent to the US being there, but kind of mumbling, not very vocal opposition, with Afghanistan, Russia, India, China, they all thought that that's a great idea. Afghanistan had long been a problem. You know, it's geostrategically, it's in a useful place. You can have revival of the Silk Road if only it would settle down. It's got minerals, it's got resources. It could have a pipeline for the natural gas of Central Asia to go down to India, which desperately needs it. But, you know, it's roiled with these factional fighting and these radicals. And so Once Bush went into Afghanistan, I think it was very hard for the United States to get back out, in part because it kept getting pressured by the other powers to please stay there. The Russians are very afraid of the opium from Afghanistan, and they have a kind of conspiracy theory. I mean, from my point of view, they overdo it. As Vladimir Putin, the current president, thinks that the Russian youth are having their energies sapped by drugs, and including Afghanistan opium. And he also thinks one of the reasons the Russians are not having so many children is that, you know, they're just shooting up all the time. So if you pay attention to the Russian foreign ministry statements about the US and Afghanistan, they typically are saying the US is not, you know, fighting hard enough to stop the drugs from coming up into Russia. And then India also is afraid of the Taliban and afraid of resurgence of radical Islam. It could spill over into India. And so they, whenever they meet with Obama, they say, please stay there longer and so forth. So in any case, you had this moment where the United States could and did invade and occupy two major countries in the region, and the rest of the world either didn't say much about it or thought it was a great idea. Well, there were effects in the region of these actions. One of them was a new set of political alliances became possible for Iran. Iran had been contained. I don't know if the Soviet Union ever was really contained. That was the stated policy of the United States. But I want to tell you, Iran was contained. It had Saddam Hussein on one side, it had the Taliban on the other. It was more or less excluded from the Arab world. Hosni Mubarak deeply disliked them. Saddam Hussein had fought a war against them and gotten the rest of the Arab world behind him. I can't tell you how wounded the Iranians were. They thought, we made this nice Islamic revolution. We showed the world that you could stand up to the inroads of Western materialism and immorality, and you could be authentic Muslims. And the first chance it got, the rest of the Muslim world lined up behind Saddam Hussein against them. But when Saddam was gone, and the Shiites outmaneuvered Bush and got a Shiite government elected in Iraq, and Hezbollah became influential in Beirut politics, and Syria was still looking around, having lost its daddy when the Soviet Union fell for a sugar daddy. All of a sudden, the ducks were all lined up so that you could have a Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut alliance. And when that gradually took shape, it took a while because Iraq was willing to make nice with Iran, but didn't really like the Syrian regime. Over time, Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq, came to see the Syrian regime as far better than the alternatives, which might be radical Sunnism. So that you got this what King Abdullah II of Jordan called a Shiite crescent. I think when he said it, it wasn't true. But over time, diplomatically speaking at least, it came to have some truth. And it's also not an exact term, because the reason the Iranians backed the Baath party in Syria is not because the Alawite Shiites predominate in the upper echelons of that party. It's because they're willing to ally with Iran, and they have some of the same enemies and so forth. And the Baath party, is very, very secular-minded. So it's not an ideological thing necessarily. But it's something that's very threatening to some regional powers, and it inadvertently was the result of the Bush administration's overthrow of the Baath regime in Iraq. Being a president ages you fast. That poster is not from so long ago. Now, a new character came on the scene with Barack Obama. became an Illinois state senator. While he was state senator, he opposed the Iraq War. That's not important. Nobody cares what state senators think about foreign policy. But it was important for him as an expression of his position. And then later on, of course, he was elected to the National Senate, where he continued to be a critic of that war. And Barack Obama's critique of the Iraq War was a moral critique to some extent, but also a pragmatic one. And I think it's typical of Obama that he mixes pragmatism with moralism. He doesn't let the one interfere with the other too much. But he felt that the Iraq War was fought on false pretenses, that it was an illegal war, which I think if you take the United Nations Charter seriously, it certainly was. But he also thought that it was poorly done, and it resulted in a quagmire. It cost a lot of lives, a lot of money, and so was, I think it was Talleyrand who once said of something that Napoleon did, that it was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. I think that's pretty much how Obama feels about the Iraq War. And so when he campaigned for president in 2008, he campaigned against the Iraq War. He campaigned for ending it, for bringing U.S. troops home, and so forth. And generally speaking, Obama was reacting against the excesses of the zeros and the era of American hyperpower. He clearly wanted more international cooperation. He wasn't comfortable with the U.S. Just invading countries at the drop of a hat. And moreover, it should be remembered that Obama, well, he has a very complex biography, but I mean, more or less, he's a Hawaiian. And therefore, Asia is much on his mind. And his childhood, he spent part of it in Indonesia, and then he grew up in Hawaii. So if you're in Hawaii, Asia is not very far away. It's all around you. And you hear it and see it around you all the time. And so my reading of Obama is that he thinks that the Pacific Rim is the economic and military and diplomatic powerhouse of the future. And I think he wouldn't say this, he's a very gentlemanly person, but I don't think that he quite understands Americans' obsessions with the Middle East. I mean, if you did it by the numbers, the trade of the United States with the Middle East is really quite minimal. And the Middle East is full of faction fighting and diplomatic wrangling. And I think Obama can't understand what's the percentage in getting involved in this thing. Whereas, you know, Japan and China now have a tiff about some islands. But as a great power, if the United States backs Japan in that tiff, well, Japan is the third largest economy in the world, and that could amount to something if you do that. I mean, diplomatically, it turns into things. Whereas if you take one side against another in the Middle East, it just seems like, you know, everybody is angry at you. For various reasons, Obama talks about rebalancing towards Asia. He thinks the Bush administration was crazy, that, you know, Afghanistan, really? That they should just get out of all of those Middle Eastern wars and entanglements and make really good friends with the Filipinos and the Thais and the Japanese. And you know, everybody in Washington thinks that the next big rivalry in world affairs is going to be with China. And I don't think Obama disagrees with the realists like John Mearsheimer, who thinks it's inevitable that there's going to be a conflict with China. He thinks that the Chinese relationship can be managed. But it's that kind of relationship that's important, and not the kinds of things that the Bush administration had been doing in the Middle East. And it may also be, Obama doesn't say these things explicitly, but you know, he is a champion of alternative energy. He is worried about the rising of the seas and climate change. He has had the Environmental Protection Agency move rather radically against the coal industry. Under Obama, wind power in the United States has risen to now be 6% of our electricity generation from almost nothing. And this is in part because of programs that he put in place. Solar is also making strides under Obama and so forth. And to the extent that the Texans who were in charge of the United States in the early zeros felt that the world revolves around petroleum, and therefore, like having Iraq would be great. From Obama's point of view, I think petroleum is a declining resource. It's going to be valuable, even if they don't use it to run automobiles. Petrochemicals, fertilizer, plastics, there are all kinds of things you can do with petroleum. But from Obama's point of view, all those things are not so closely tied to national security as transportation is. From Obama's point of view, we're going to find in the not so distant future, ways of generating electricity and ways of transporting people that don't depend on hydrocarbons. And therefore, if you were making a bet on the future, you wouldn't make a bet on securing petroleum supplies. You would make a bet on world trade and world finance, and you would make a bet on the Pacific Rim. So the other thing about Obama and the Middle East is that the Bush administration had a taboo system. If the Bush administration didn't like a regime, they kind of played what I call aggressive ostrich. They talked dirty about it, threatened it, but also pretended it didn't exist. It was a little bit contradictory in my view. So Syria is an example. They just cut Syria off. There was no diplomatic relations. It was good times for Syria analysts, people who flew to Damascus and were new people in the regime, because Washington wouldn't talk to Damascus, so then they kept bringing the people who specialized in Syria to Washington to ask them. But Obama didn't see the point of these taboos. He thought you should talk to your enemies, you should negotiate with your enemies. Who would you negotiate with except your enemies? So he restarted diplomatic relations with Syria. He was willing to talk directly to al-Assad. He, I think, had some hopes that Bashar al-Assad, who had the Damascus Spring and might moderate his dictatorship. So it's very ironic that Bush came to the Middle East and said, you have to democratize, and by God, if you don't, we're going to invade. And the Middle East said, nah, we're not interested. And then Obama came to the Middle East and said, well, I'll deal with you as you are, knock yourselves out, do what you want. And they said, we're going to democratize. And then Obama was willing to talk directly to Iran, which again was a taboo. I think there was actually a diplomatic tiff at one point when a Bush administration diplomatic official said hello to Larijani or somebody at a cocktail party. But Obama was willing to talk to Iran. So Obama wanted to get out of the Middle East militarily. He wanted to engage with the Middle East at least lightly diplomatically. He wanted to be pragmatic about the Middle East. And the poor man, despite these aspirations that he had, couldn't get away from the place. And so the Arab Spring broke out, and he had to have a policy on the Arab Spring. And at first, the status quo was the policy, but that was untenable. And so finally, people keep saying that he pushed Mubarak under the bus. But as far as I could tell, he more kind of nudged Mubarak when Mubarak was already mostly under the bus. And then the uprising took place in Libya. And I still can't tell you why exactly. We historians like to see the memos and to have the the internal workings of things, and we can't do that always for contemporary history. But for some reason, Nicolas Sarkozy in France and David Cameron decided that they wanted Muammar Gaddafi gone. It is said that Sarkozy thought, he was down in the polls and he thought that Libya would be a quick victory. And to some extent, you don't really need to explain a French intervention in Africa because it's just sort of what they do in life and fairly institutionalized. What I really can't understand is Cameron, who's a Tory and hadn't shown any particular foreign policy hawkishness, and suddenly he joined in with Sarkozy in wanting to get rid of Gaddafi. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia and much of the Arab world wanted Gaddafi gone. Gaddafi was a trickster character. If you had a meeting of the Arab League, they all had a knife out of their backs, and it all had Muammar Gaddafi written on the handle. Did Morocco have a problem with the Polisario in the Western Sahara? Gaddafi sending money to Polisario. Did Saddam Hussein have a war with Iran? Gaddafi sending missiles to Iran. Gaddafi at one point told King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia to his face that he was a colonized lackey. I don't think King Abdullah is used to being talked to like that. So when it was clear that Gaddafi was in trouble, and then he started killing his own people with tanks and planes and so forth, the Arab League met and decided it was best to push him off the stage. And then they went to the United Nations Security Council and asked the Security Council to do that. And Sarkozy and Cameron were all on board. And Obama wasn't. Obama didn't want another war in the Middle East. He had campaigned against military entanglement in the Middle East. He was just out of, just about out of Iraq. He wanted to wind this thing down, and we know now he knew that he had Osama bin Laden in his sights. So the whole Al-Qaeda thing was probably over with soon. So he was very unhappy. From everything I've heard, I know people who were in the White House then, and they said that as late as March 19th, the word in the White House was that it was a no-go. The United States was not going to get involved in this thing. But I think what happened was that they wanted to do a no-fly zone in Libya, and you can't do a no-fly zone without a lot of danger to your planes as long as there are anti-aircraft batteries on the ground. And the French and the British don't have a lot of smart weaponry, precision-targeted weaponry, not nearly to the extent the United States has it. So if you want to take out an anti-aircraft battery, you have to actually hit it. It doesn't do you any good to hit next to it. And so they needed the United States to take out the anti-aircraft battery. And Obama had gone to Cameron and Sarkozy and said, guys, don't leave Afghanistan yet. There's still work to be done. Al-Qaeda is still out there. And we need you for another year or two, because they were inclined to just withdraw. And so I think he owed them. So then he got involved in Libya, but he tried to downplay it, and he led from behind, and they just took out the anti-aircraft carriers and then told the Danish, you're on your own. And then Syria starts to unfold in March of that year as well. And if Obama didn't really want to get involved in Libya and was pulled into it against his better judgment, he was darned if he was going to get pulled into Syria. In Syria, the revolution began with peaceful protests, with graffiti, and with crowds in the streets. There was mostly, these Arab Spring events, mostly 20-year-olds doing flash mobs. It's the kind of thing American youth do this at malls, but with a less serious purpose. But it wasn't, in my view, a dire threat to the Syrian regime to have this going on. But the Syrian regime doesn't take dissidents lightly. It had a long history of jailing and torturing and even killing people who spoke out against it. And to have crowds of young people gathering and openly chanting against the regime was too much. And so Maher al-Assad, the president's brother who heads an important armored division, drew up tanks and started firing on these demonstrators. And over time, drove them into picking up arms to fight back. I would argue that the regime really shot itself in the foot by the way it behaved. In response to this deadly violence deployed against unarmed, non-combatant protesters, the European Union and the United States responded with financial sanctions. You know, Maher al-Assad can't vacation on the Riviera anymore, and so forth. But obviously, those kinds of steps are symbolic and not practical. One of the problems for any talk of intervention in Syria at that time in 2011 was also that, whereas it seemed clear to me at least that almost everybody in Libya hated Gaddafi's guts, and the only people who weren't saying so openly by summer of 2011 were people who still could be gotten at by Gaddafi's revolutionary committees and so were afraid. And in Syria, there were a lot of people, maybe half of the population, who maybe they didn't support the regime so much, but they were afraid of what might come after. Syria is an extremely diverse society. You have 10% Alawis, who are a kind of Shiite, a sect of Shiism. You have between 10 and 14% Christians. I mean, the social statistics are not clear on this, but it could be as much as 14%. That would be more Christians in Syria than we have Latinos in the United States. And Latinos are a very major group in the United States now, proportionally speaking. And then you have Druze, you have Ismailis, and aside from the religious minorities, who probably come to on the order of 25 to 30% of the population, you also then have 2 million Kurds, who, although they're Sunni, were mistreated by the Baath regime, and many of them had their citizenship withdrawn. So they're Badoon. They're born bred. They've been in. Salahuddin Ayyubi, the Saladin, was a Kurd from that part of the world. I mean, they've been there a long time, but they were declared not citizens by the Baath party, many of them. So they're not with the regime. So you've got 40% right there, Kurds and religious minorities who had difficult relations with the regime, but were afraid of what might come next. And everybody knew that one of the major things that might come next would be the Muslim Brotherhood, would be even more radical forms of Sunni political Islam. And then you have a lot of secular-minded Sunni Arabs in Syria. So it wasn't clear that a vast majority of the Syrians wanted the regime to fall. And in my view, by now it is clear that if not everybody, but a very substantial majority now wants the regime gone. But it was because of the brutality with which the regime dealt with dissent. So the US didn't intervene in Syria as it did in Libya. And I think Obama got his way on this one. In part, it was because Russia and China blocked any United Nations Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force. Now, in the United States, nobody much pays any attention to international law. But the fact is that the use of force by one country against another is illegal, except under two conditions. One is self-defense. So you can always defend yourself if another country attacks you. You don't need anybody's permission to do that. And the other, according to the United Nations Charter, is if the United Nations Security Council meets about a country and says, well, that country is a real troublemaker. Somebody ought to do something about it, which is what happened to Libya. But Russia and China won't let the United Nations Security Council come to such a resolution about Syria. And so I've been told by French diplomats, for instance, who really, really would like to see France intervene in Syria, which, you know, is a former French colony, but who said our hands are tied because there's no authorization for use of force. And inside Europe, these international laws are taken increasingly seriously. I mean, they're courts. I mean, if you broke international law, you could end up in The Hague. And while it's not very likely that that would happen at a high level, you can't rule it out in Europe now. So there could be consequences of bucking the UN on this. And then intervention, what kind of intervention would you have? From the point of view of military logistics, Libya was a prime place in which an intervention was against the regime from the outside was plausible because with precision targeting, you could hit tanks and you could hit weapons depots, which the regime had and was deploying against unarmed civilians initially and then against rebels as they took up arms. And in Libya, the way it would happen is you would have a lot of tanks at a barracks in Tripoli and you would send them out over these desert roads to Brega. Well, on the way, they're sitting ducks. So an intervention against the Libyan use of armor against the people of Misrata, for instance, that was plausible. That could be done. But Syria's geography is not the same, and the way the regime was deploying was not the same. A lot of people get killed in Syria because the regime just puts snipers up on the roof. And when people come out to protest, they kill 10. They have a quota, daily quota in each town. And they're hoping that, the political scientists say that something like that is the regime is raising the cost of protesting. And you don't know if you're going to be one of the 10. And they assume that after a while people would stop being brave enough to come out because they might be one of the 10. But actually, as far as I can tell, as we speak, at night, around midnight, in a lot of small towns around Syria, people are still coming out and risking that sniping. Well, what could you do about that as an external actor? Nothing. So between the Russian and the Chinese veto and the military geography of Syria, and then Obama's fears of quagmire, and by now you're starting to get into the election season, and Obama wants to campaign on ending Middle Eastern entanglements, right? And having gotten out of Iraq. So it won't do him any good to say, boast, you know, we got out of Iraq, guys, it's over with. And the American public would be happy about that if his enemies could turn around and say, yeah, but now you've gotten us into Syria. So he didn't want that. And it's not clear who would take over Syria. And you had the emergence now of Jabhat al-Nusra, a radical group that the US is afraid has ties to al-Qaeda in Iraq. You don't know, in a revolution, you don't know who's going to come out on top. Nobody could have predicted in 1789 that Robespierre would be guillotining people 3 years later. So they're afraid about what might happen. The neighbors are afraid. Nouri al-Maliki is now backing the Syrian regime because he's, after having attacked it viciously for years, but he's now more afraid of Sunni radicalism. Jordan is afraid, and so forth. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, on Obama not to do anything precipitous. Why does China veto a UN Security Council resolution? Well, it's not for economic reasons. There's a Leninist theory of imperialism that everything is done by great powers of a neocolonial sort for reasons of making money or wanting resources. This is not true, and I can prove it, or this is not universally true. I mean, certainly there are instances where great powers act according to their economic interests. But it's not universally true, because the entire history of European colonialism in Africa, in which often things were done just to compete with a European rival in places that had no resources. And my poster child for this argument is the British in Gambia. There was no slavery in Gambia, and there are no resources in Gambia. It has a very nice river, but there was no reason for the British to be there if it was economic imperialism. And they actually tried to give it to the French. The French said, well, we could take it off your hands, but you'd have to pay us something. So they kept it. So China is not vetoing this resolution because of its economic interests in Syria. The Syrians import $2 billion a year of goods from China. For China, that's a drop in the bucket. The Chinese do have joint petroleum ventures in Syria, and before the turmoil, they were exploring further petroleum and gas deals. But Syria is just not a major player. I mean, I think it was doing 350,000 barrels a day before the revolution, which again, that is 90 million barrels a day are pumped in the world daily. So you can't entirely explain Chinese actions with respect to oil. I think indirectly these considerations play a larger role because China, 11% of China's petroleum comes from Iran. And China is developing the Korna 1 field not so far from here near Basra. And it's set maybe to be the largest importer of petroleum from Iraq over the next 20 years. So to the extent that turmoil in Syria can spill over and affect Iraq and Iran, maybe that's one reason to keep the Baath regime there. But I think the other thing is that the Chinese Communist Party and the Syrian Baath Party have some resemblances. And the Chinese are afraid of that people might notice in China the resemblance. So they don't want an Arab Spring in a Jasmine Revolution in China. And so, ironically enough, these guys, you know, for all of my life, they kept saying we had to have a revolution, we had to have a revolution, we were bourgeois, we were decadent, why weren't we having a revolution? Now they're going around and saying, no revolutions, please, we don't want any revolutions, we should make money. And so they have generally opposed the Arab Spring. And I think that's one consideration. They just don't want a successful revolution in Syria would maybe be noticed by dissidents in China, and they don't want that. I think the other thing is that they're increasingly playing great power politics, which means asserting spheres of influence. So Sudan is kind of becoming a Chinese sphere of influence. And there's a play being made for Angola. And much of Africa is now a Chinese playground. They're doing building projects and doing foreign aid and importing resources. And they're acting like, you know, any other great power, which they hadn't for a long time after Deng Xiaoping took the capitalist road. The Chinese behaved a lot like Switzerland or Holland. You know, keep your head down, don't make waves, and just rake in the money. But this is changing now. They said they want an aircraft carrier group. And the US embassy sent over a sharp note to the Chinese government that what do you want with an aircraft carrier group exactly? The US has 11. I'm not sure why it's in a position to question China's desire for one. So the Chinese, even in November, put forward a peace plan for Syria. It wasn't a very good peace plan or a very practical one. They hoped that the two sides would talk. But again, we haven't seen anything like that from the Chinese anytime recently. So again, China is emerging. And the stance it's taken at the UN on Syria, it seems to me, as a signal of that emergence as a great power. Likewise, there's an economic argument for Russia's protection of the Syrian regime. And in Russia's case, it makes a little bit more sense. I mean, Syria was a client state of the Soviet Union. There are long-term relationships between the two countries. The Syrians did lease the Tartus naval base to the Russians from 71, and then in the last decade, the Russians have expanded it and made it into a proper naval base. Syria is the 7th largest arms purchaser from Russia. Over the past few years, it's purchased $4 billion worth of arms. And the Russian economy is such that that's actually not an insignificant figure. That's important. And then there are $19 billion worth of Russian investments in Syria, mainly in oil and gas, but also in some other sectors of the economy. So Syria, is important economically to Russia. I don't think it's extremely important, but it has a certain importance. But when Vladimir Putin talks about Syria, he doesn't instance those economic factors. He says he's worried about a never-ending civil war. He's worried about Syria becoming Iraq. And he's worried that if the Alawis are overthrown, that they'll just take up arms in Latakia and they'll become a guerrilla group, and they'll be bombing Damascus into the next decade, and that there's a revolution in which the Baath is overthrown and the Alawis are reduced to a oppressed minority is a future in which Syria is in perpetual civil war. This is Putin's analysis of it, and he instances the instability in Libya as something that should be avoided at all costs in Syria. I was in Libya in May and June, and it has security problems, obviously, but it's not that bad. I mean, there are neighborhood militias, and occasionally they make trouble. And there was that very unpleasant incident in Benghazi where they killed the American ambassador. But that was a small fringe group, and the rest of the people in Benghazi came out the next day and beat them up and chased them out of the city. And then actually in Tripoli and so forth, people go about their business. So I think Putin's idea that Libya is some kind of a hellhole that should be avoided at all costs for Syria is not actually true. Obviously, Syria is going to have a lot of security problems for the next few years. And there's thinking in Russia, in the Russian Federation, of what I see as almost a paranoid sort. Putin has started talking about Russia being ringed by enemies. So he's nervous. The Russians are nervous about Chinese, maybe the Chinese having designs on the Russian Far East. And then NATO is right next up against it, and you have NATO in Afghanistan. So from his point of view, he's like Russia is under siege from all of these enemies. And Mahmoud Gurayev, obviously Uzbek or something, but an influential military academic, has talked recently about the color revolutions and the attempt to implement democracy in countries is a kind of tool of the CIA to overthrow unfriendly regimes and weaken the backers of those regimes. And then I just wanted to show you that as far as I can tell, Russia is not actually ringed by enemies. Mongolia, even if it were anti-Russian, I don't think it amounts to much. Kazakhstan, very friendly with Russia. Ukraine, well, it's kind of got its own problems. Finland, not so much. So I don't know. I mean, it seems to me like, as I said, it's kind of paranoid to talk like that. But anyway, Gurayev says that they're afraid in Russia of these color revolutions. Maybe even Putin himself, who has seen big demonstrations against himself in Moscow, is afraid of them. And then the other way that the NATO countries, the hegemonic countries, have changed political reality is just to invade. And so they're afraid that this is the plan for Syria, and after Syria it will be Russia next. So you have to, it's like the old American domino theory in the Vietnam War period. You have to stop NATO at Syria in order to have Russia not itself be overthrown. So to conclude, I'm arguing that Syria has become the site of a renewed great power rivalry, that the rising power of China, the reconstituting power of the Russian Federation are now making assertions of spheres of influence in a way that they hadn't in the past 2 decades. There's a scramble now again for client states, and that this caesura we saw, this post-war interregnum, this period of 20 years in which the United States was the hyperpower, was the sole superpower, has abruptly come to an end. The United States can't act as it pleases in Syria. So we're in for the beginning of a new multipolar global politics in which, over time, India and Brazil and others will also be important. And in fact, the BRIC nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRIC nations' combined economic weight is beginning to rival that of the G8. So there's new kids on the block. And mostly, the BRIC nations have a doctrine of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. So they're against interference in Syria. They were against interference in Libya, by analogy, because they don't want it to happen to them, and often they've been on the receiving end of such interventions. And I think, again, that NATO made mistakes in being so aggressive with post-Soviet Russia that it's gotten their backs up. And so Putin in particular, I think, is someone who wants to draw a line and say thus far and no further. So the situation in Syria is very complex. Syria is internally deeply divided. There are regional configurations with Iran on one side and Qatar and Saudi Arabia on the other. But I would argue that the emergence of a new great power political order is being signaled by this paralysis over Syria. Thank you very much.
My name is Dr. Ariba Al-Laham. I'm from Georgetown University. I am Syrian American, and thank you for your lecture. I have a lot of questions, honestly, but I'm going to summarize it. Number one, the theory that you took is geopolitics, and I was waiting to hear from you about Israel, honestly, because what's happening, the difference between Libya and Syria for the United States is the fact that we have a border with Israel, and Bashar al-Assad has been a protector of Israel for 40 years. So this is a very important issue that you did not tackle. This is number one. Number two, you said that inside Syria, there were 40% people who would back the regime, and that's why Obama was, cautious not to interfere. I was going to ask you the same question. How come did they ask the opinion of Libyan when they interfered, and that was few months earlier? I mean, this is really, for me, as a Syrian, hard to digest. How come it was very easy for them to make a decision to go into Libya just because they have oil? And I repeat, they have oil, we have nothing. And we have Bashar al-Assad who's protecting Israel. So, I mean, there are a lot of things.
Let me take that much, sure, because I'll forget them. Okay, so first of all, they didn't do what they did to Libya because it has oil. The oil companies were already in Libya. Gaddafi had done billions of dollars of deals with the Italians, the Spanish, Tony Blair brought BP there in 2007. And in fact, this war put all of that in doubt. And the major oil companies suffered losses during the war. And there's no reason for the oil companies to pressure Sarkozy, and I'm not sure they did, to invade Libya to get more Libyan oil when they had all that they wanted. I mean, the idea that somehow Gaddafi was not letting them into his market is just not true. So that whole theory makes no sense to me. And I agree with you, it's also not the 350,000 barrels a day in Syria are not a consideration. But with regard to your other issue of Israel, as far as I can tell from the outside, the Israeli security establishment is itself deeply divided about what should happen in Syria. You had figures like Avigdor Lieberman, the leader of the Israel Betenu party, who's now in coalition with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who are very enthusiastic kind of neoconservative promoters of the revolution in Syria and who, is a big ally of the Syrian revolution. But then, as far as I can tell, you have some generals and some intelligence officials who look at this situation in Syria and say, well, as you said, the Baath party really hasn't done anything to us over these years, and maybe it's better it doesn't get overthrown by people we don't know and whose intentions towards Israel. Yeah, well, no, but they're building a wall because they're afraid that this thing will spill over on them, which it may well. But in any case, the reason I didn't bring in Israel is because I see them as paralyzed about this policy-wise. I haven't seen Israel do anything about this revolution. And Lieberman is one of the very few vocal voices, and his policies have not been adopted as far as I can tell. So I don't think that they're consequential, the Israelis, to this particular struggle. I think it's happening on the ground among Syrians, and there are other regional powers. I mean, I think little Qatar is far more important to what ends up happening in Syria than Israel is, ironically enough. And it's not because Israel isn't powerful or couldn't intervene or hasn't thought about it. It's because I don't think they know what they want here. I don't think they know what outcome would benefit them the most, and therefore they're being cautious. And then the third thing about the divisions in Syria, what I said was simply that you had a situation in Syria where, frankly, let's be frank here, I'm an academic, so I'm sorry if I speak bluntly, you had Christian leaders coming to Washington and saying, we're very afraid of what happens if Assad goes. And I can show you the newspaper articles. And Christian leaders in the Middle East speak with a very loud voice because you have the evangelicals and you have the lobbies and so forth. So what I meant to say was simply that ambivalence that Washington was hearing from the Syrian population or from sectors of it, you didn't hear that from Libya. There was no group of Libyans that had connections to Washington who was going and saying, no, Gaddafi is great. That didn't exist. But I think there really was a social historical difference between the two.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to take a point with you in your description of the Middle East during the Cold War period. The reality was that there was a struggle, but the struggle was between British and American interests. This is why America backed Gamal Abdel Nasser and promoted him to promote nationalism, to dislodge Britain from within the region, as described within the book called Game Player by Miles Copeland, the main CIA operative in the Middle East there, who also added about the struggle within Syria, where within a period of 10 years, there was 6 overthrows. Each group was one backed by Britain, one backed by America there. Second quick point I'd just like to say, the point that you'd made about Obama and the contradictions in his behavior in terms of how to deal with Syria, it's basically between defending, protecting the interests of America, and making out that they believe in freedom. So when you look at Syria, it served American interests very, very well there, protected the border of Israel, the 91 war, Syria went into war there, in addition to collecting all the so-called terrorists and sending them to America and torturing them and so forth, and in addition to that, sending Syria into Lebanon there. So therefore, what we really see there is a game which is being played behind the scenes. Same with Iran. Iran has served America very well, stabilized Iraq for America to invade that, stabilized Afghanistan, sold billions of dollars of weapons to the Middle East here, trying to make Iran as this invading force there. So the reality is that at present, we're having another Bosnia, whereby you are preventing weapons from reaching the people and allowing the major power, the major group there to massacre the people until we get rid of all the Islamic feelings and allowing the people to empower themselves to take power and establish what they want to establish. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I would take issue with some of your points, not because they're incorrect, but because I think they're pertaining to a particular time period and not to another. So yes, in the late 40s, early 50s, everybody knows the United States moved Britain out of the Middle East, and the British, if you read their dispatches, were very annoyed about it. But by the mid-50s, the major thing that was on Eisenhower's mind was the Soviet Union, not Britain. It was why the United States told France, Britain, and Israel to get out of Egypt in 1956, 57 was not because the United States, Eisenhower was a champion of democratization and anti-imperial and so forth. What he was afraid of was that this tripartite invasion of Egypt would push Abdel Nasser into the hands of the Soviet Union, which over time did happen. So when I was talking about the Cold War, I was really talking about the late 50s and through the 60s and 70s, in which the United States really was obsessed with Soviet influence in the region. It's quite striking to me when you read the dispatches of American diplomats in that period, how they concentrate on small labor groups and Trotskyites and people who really didn't probably pose large dangers to US foreign policy. And the word Muslim is almost never mentioned. I mean, you would, from reading these dispatches, you wouldn't know that most Iraqis were Shiite Muslims. It was all about communism and leftist groups. So they really were quite focused on the Soviet Union and saw themselves as in a match with them. And that came into the 73 war when they went to nuclear alert and so forth. And with regard to Syria, again, I would just argue that that you have put together many things, strung them together with regard to Syria atemporally. I'm a historian. I like things to be in order of time. So yes, after 9/11, the United States government was perfectly happy to have Bashar al-Assad torture Daraqani and other, especially Syrian al-Qaeda operatives for them. But then Congress took it into its head in 2003 to pass the Syria Accountability Act, which cut off relations between the United States and Syria. And there were probably people in the Bush administration who were annoyed at Congress for having done that, but they did it. And between 2003 and 2009, there were no diplomatic relations, and Syria was not torturing anybody for the United States, and there were very bad relations between the two countries. So the idea that the Baath regime kind of was a loyal servant of American interests all along is just not true. And in that period after 2003, once the US imposed sanctions on Syria, the Syrian regime got cozier and cozier with Iran and was not at all on the same page with the United States. So I don't think there's a simplistic answer to US foreign policy towards Syria. I mean, it's been alleged that the US doesn't overthrow the Baath regime because it's been so nice to Israel, and I think most Israelis would find that a bizarre kind of assertion. It's given offices to groups that have attacked Israelis and so forth. And then it's been alleged that, the Syrian regime was helping the U.S. in its fight against al-Qaeda. And that was maybe true in the first couple of years after 9/11, but by 2005, 2006, the U.S. government behind the scenes, and we know this from WikiLeaks, was deeply afraid that the Syrian regime was encouraging al-Qaeda operatives to come through the Syrian border into Iraq and blow up U.S. troops. And so it saw a kind of Baath Alawi al-Qaeda alliance, which I find a little bit unlikely anyway. But anyway, the regime was seen as a hostile regime by that period. So I just don't, I don't think it's so simple. I think things changed over time and the relationship changed. And what was really ironic was that Obama wanted to open back up Syria. He sent out Ford. He had an ambassador. He thought maybe Bashar was somebody he could do business with. And then it all went to hell, and it presented a diplomatic and political problem for Obama. And Obama has dealt with that by studiously ignoring it.
Thank you, Professor, for this great presentation. My name is Muhammad Al-Khalil. I'm also from New York University, Abu Dhabi. And I will go back to the central argument that you presented about the return of great power politics into the region. And I do agree with you in general of that, but I differ to some extent, or at least I'm not sure about the emphasis on Russia and China. What I would like to just go back and talk about the politics of the United States itself in Syria, especially after the revolution and just before the revolution, with President Obama himself's speech in Cairo and the hope that he raised in the Middle East. And then this is which we believed somehow created some high expectations among the people, especially in Syria. So they looked at Syria, at the U.S. as an ally. And the Syrian revolutionaries, at least, see the U.S. as an ally. But the peak of that was when the U.S. ambassador visited Hama in June of 2011, and he was met with roses, and the various activities that the U.S. ambassador took in Syria in support of the revolution publicly, which I believe it was not just a personal initiative, but part of a policy from the administration. But then, if you look at the track of what happened ultimately, and you gauge the sentiment and the feelings of Syrians at the time, and how they were very friendly and very, they looked at positively at the U.S. And now you look at it right now, they look at the U.S. pretty much as an enemy, or at the worst as a manipulator. And there is some evidence that the U.S. is actually playing great power politics with Syria. Partly encouraging the people in the early part of the revolution to go up against the regime, and then at the key moment, which happened in other situations in U.S. history, whether Iran in the 1950s and other examples. The key moment for me was actually also, again, is the reports, for example, within the U.S. administration, when the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and the Chief of Staff all recommended doing some covert or some active support of the rebels, and this, of course, was opposed by Obama himself and his, but in that case they didn't mention Russia or China. Even in the reports, they didn't really say that it's because Russia will veto this. This is where so they recommended, regardless of what the international community really thought, and Obama pretty much opposed it on internal reasons. So in many ways, I believe what I wanted to say is that the U.S. is not, the emphasis on China and Russia is hard, and this is what the Syrians believe. Most Syrians believe is that the Russia and China are being affronted in many ways, and Russia and China are playing because this is to their interests. They're affronted, but the U.S. is capable, and if it is willing to interact, to act differently, but in many ways it acted to manipulate the Syrian situation rather than to promote the morals or the values that it promoted in 2009.
Yeah. Well, those are good comments and perspicacious. What I suggest, though, is that there's a distinction between the U.S. committing fighter jets of its own to Syria, as it did in Libya, and covertly helping to arm and train the revolutionary forces. The first would clearly be a violation of the UN Charter and would cause a lot of trouble with China and Russia, and I don't think they will do it. The second you could get away with, it may be technically illegal as well. So I think it's a different order of action. But I mean, I think your story makes my point, which is that there were forces in the Obama administration, David Petraeus and Hillary Clinton, from what the New York Times says, who did want to more robustly arm and train and the rebels. I think this story is about August of 2012 or so. And by that point, it was clear that many of the victories that were being gained against the Syrian military were being gained by Jabhat al-Nusra. And I think Petraeus and Clinton were afraid that the al-Qaeda types would emerge as the spearhead of the revolution. And so what they really wanted to do was to create a cadre of pro-American fighters who had better weapons and better training and who could then demonstrate that they were in the forefront of the revolution and who might come out on top and favor the US once it's all over. And the reason given by Michael Gordon in the New York Times article for which Obama shot this plan down was that he did not think it would play well in the midst of the election. Covert operations are called covert because you hope that they would stay secret, but they don't usually. And so Obama was very well aware that it would likely come out during the presidential campaign that he was giving weaponry to the revolutionaries, and that, again, his claim to fame, the thing that he was campaigning on was that he was getting us out of the Middle East militarily, and he didn't want to be perceived as hypocritical in that regard. And apparently, when he said no, Clinton and Petraeus hoped to come back after the November election and press Obama on it again, but Petraeus ended up not being there anymore for extraneous reasons, and Clinton then also had that fall, which incapacitated her for a while, and now there are entirely new players on the block. My reading of Brennan, if he gets approved for CIA, is that he would agree with Obama not to get involved. And I don't know about Kerry. And also Hagel at defense is not going to want to get involved. He had his hands burned in Vietnam and in Iraq. And so my reading of it is that the Obama administration has made a policy decision not to get heavily involved in Syria.
Thank you very much, sir, for such enlightening and entertaining presentation. I'm Ubad al-Sawadi, a petroleum engineer. I do think that oil has an influence in every political problem around the world, even if it's a minor quantity, not because I'm a petroleum engineer, but it has a relation because oil companies do bring the political and the government influence into each and every country. They have played so many roles everywhere. They negotiated on behalf of countries and some other places. However, it may not be the only reason in Syria, in my opinion, and you brought up examples for that. The point I would like to raise here is what the Syrians asking for is too complicated. They're asking for freedom, and many nations around the world has taken it. Is it too difficult to give it to the Syrian people? Despite, I'm not trying to simplify it, yet politics is complicated all the time. However, they will get it, but at a very, very high price, teaching many other nations around not to seek it or destroying Syria to the ground, so all the reconstruction companies would come and benefit again from the blood that has been spoiled. What is all this about? I wouldn't touch upon Israel because it's already been asked, but what I would say, every minute, the whole world and the region delays its interact with the Syrian problem, it will further complicate it than ever. We didn't see radicals at the beginning. We didn't see rebels at the beginning. We were peacefully protesting. If we got what we wanted, it couldn't have reached this point. We see Al-Qaeda today, and we know them. They're creating problems with the Free Syrian Army and the other people. We don't want them there. But today we are willing, as Syrians, to put hands with Al-Qaeda. I'm sorry to say that. On the ground, we disagree. I disagree. But on the ground, yes, they're fighting side to side against this devil. Because this devil doesn't differentiate between people, between civilians. It's killing everybody. It's even killing those minorities to pull them on its side. So what next? And when? Do you see any light at the end of this tunnel? Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for your remarks, especially because they remind us so much of the human tragedy that we are addressing here. People are dying, people are being wounded, hundreds of thousands have been displaced. It is a horrible situation, and as somebody who lived in that part of the world and knows Syria, it breaks my heart every day. And I'm glad you said what you said. But the fact is that this is a revolution. Revolutions don't happen overnight. From the time in my own country that the revolutionaries signed a Declaration of Independence, which could well have gotten them hanged, until the last of the British troops was off their soil, was 7 years. And Mao Zedong once wrote in China after the Long March that he envied George Washington that he only had 7 years to fight. So these things are not going to be over with quickly. I wish that the United Nations were working properly, because it's a genocidal regime. According to the international law, the UN Security Council should meet, and it should say this regime has to be removed. Would the nations of the world please do something about it? But for the reasons I suggested, the United Nations is broken in this regard. It's not going to happen. So the Syrians are on their own. Being on their own, actually, they're doing pretty well. I mean, for all the tragedy that we see, the fact is that nobody could have predicted very easily 2 years ago that people who started out as unarmed civilians would end up taking the regime's military bases away from them and then looting them for weaponry and shooting down the regime's helicopters with the regime's own weapons. And actually, I think it's a very bad sign for a regime when ragtag urban rebels are taking your bases away from you. So we saw Jarrah fell on Tuesday, and Taftazan fell, and Maran is maybe going to fall. I don't think it's very long, from what I can tell what's going on the ground, and I'm seeing it from a great distance, and by YouTube and so forth. But I don't think it's very long before the revolutionaries will have the north pretty solidly. Yes, yes.
Somebody around the world can do something for the civilians.
Yes.
Trying to govern themselves even in remote and surrounded places.
Well, the world has not done the right thing on civilian aid either. Lots of pledges have been made. They've been relatively small up until recently. Luckily, at the Kuwait conference, big money was pledged. The Kuwaiti emir himself is putting in $300 million. Obama says $200 million. You know, those pledges don't always get implemented quickly, and they don't always get honored at all. But I agree with you that if the world is not going to help end this thing by intervening against the regime, at the very least, they should be doing something about those people living in tents without proper sewage, and they should be helping people build local governing capacity in liberated areas of the north. And I think that will become easier. What I was going to say is, I think we're maybe a little bit of a distance from the fall of the regime. But we're not very far now, in my view, from having a consolidated block of territory in the north. If those last bases can be gotten rid of, if the regime can't use air to resupply, already its convoys can't get up there. And once you have a consolidated territory in the north, which abuts Turkey, the ability to put in those kinds of resources will increase. And so my own prognostication for Syria is that likely the regime will fall. I wouldn't be surprised if it falls this year. And in the aftermath, I think there will be an interim government, and then a year or two down the road, there will be elections. And I'd have to tell you that I'm not very afraid of Jabhat al-Nusra or the radical groups that have grown up. We see these in all revolutions, and it happened in Libya as well. Do you know, everybody was worried about that Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who had been arrested by the Americans, and he was considered radical, and he was one of the best fighters, and his unit took over Tripoli, and then he was the head of security for Tripoli in post-revolutionary Libya. When they went to having elections, he couldn't win a seat. He has a party, he's unemployed. So I think the same thing will happen with radicals in Syria. If you think about it, if you go to elections in Syria, elections are wonderful for consensus making and bargaining and working out problems. So there's going to be representatives from Latakia and from Idlib and from Hasaka, and the likelihood of really radical people being elected in a country like Syria, which has all of these groups, Christians and Kurds and Alawis and secular Sunnis and Sufis. People forget about the Sufis. A lot of Syrians are Sufis, and they don't like those radicals. So in such a situation, it seems to me multi-party, pluralistic elections are likely to take place, and the resulting parliament is very unlikely to be dominated by one group, and so they'll have to compromise with each other and bargain and so forth. Now, that will be down the road. 5 years from now, I'll buy you coffee, and we can celebrate liberated democratic Syria. Yeah.